For 100 years, the idea of equality was the bedrock of democratic socialism. Now, the parties of the left seem to have lost faith in the old ideal. Or at least they've lost faith in their ability to win elections if they talk about redistribution and the tax increases that it requires. I believe in the creation of a society in which power and wealth are more equally distributed. To me, narrowing the gap between rich and poor seems elementary social justice. So does a general extension of rights, real access to the law, and protection against discrimination. What's more, I think the whole community benefits from improving general standards of education, housing and health. But can a party committed to redistribution ever win an election? Tonight I'm going to discuss these questions with 4 advocates of greater social justice. J.K. Galbraith, a Harvard professor for 40 years, was an advisor to President Kennedy. He'd become the guru of the Democratic left. Tony Blair MP is Shadow Home Secretary. He's a member of Labour's National Executive. Ben Pimlott is a historian. He's a biographer of Harold Wilson and an ex-Labour candidate. Patricia Hewitt is Deputy Director of a radical think tank and a member of Labour's Independent Commission on Social Justice. Tony, all of us here have talked about equality, fairness, social justice, and demanded more of it. What is it that we're after when we talk about that rather amorphous idea?
I think what we're about, first of all, obviously, it includes the notion of equality of opportunity. But I think it goes further than that. I think it's also about, if you like, the equality of dignity, of treatment of people within society. And I think it also has within it the idea that to create a society at all, for the notion of community to have any meaning, then there must be a certain degree at least of equality of outcome. Otherwise the disparity, the divisions in society are so great that the notion of a cohesive community simply doesn't ring true at all.
You're suggesting, Tony, that capitalism, the modern... Nobody wants to use that term anymore, the modern market system. Are you suggesting that it is inherently unequal?
I think that if it is simply left to its own devices, then it produces outcomes that are inherently unequal, yes.
I basically agree with that. I'm just trying to get you to avoid the evasion, which someone told me is now customary in the House of Commons. Is that true?
Well, I don't think I've evaded it, but I mean, I think that the difficulty with the concept of equality for people of my generation is that it came to be, particularly I think in the 60s and 70s, it came to be identified with absolute equality of outcome, of a sort of strict egalitarianism in the sense that everybody earned or everybody received the same amount of money.
Well, let's get some more definitions. I mean, on the crucial question of whether it is a uniformity which is unacceptable to everybody round this room.
I think diversity is attractive, actually, to most people, except to ideologues. The problem is providing an equality of opportunity which really is genuine to everybody living in council flats and on supplementary benefit and so on everywhere. And the second, clearly, is some core notion that everyone should be treated the same, that everyone has an equal value, and that not only before the law, but in practice, the treatment of everybody should be not identical, because identity is impossible, but that there should be real concern that nobody gets special privileges. And a lot of it, I think, is about abolishing privilege.
But there's an aspect of this that's beginning to disturb me a bit. We all are in favor of equality of opportunity. That's something that we can assume, and even the most austere Republicans in the United States will make glowing speeches on that. What we must address, it seems to me, is how do you get equality of opportunity? And what is the role of the government?
Well, I think I would start by looking at the gulf in life chances between the child of any of our families, born in very comfortable conditions, with well-educated, employed parents, with an awful lot of opportunities ahead of her.
So then anybody should have the right to go to Oxford or Cambridge?
Everybody,
equally.
every child ought to have the right to get the best possible education, to discover their potential and to fulfill it.
When I was 11, it was thought that equality of opportunity was every little boy and every little girl taking the same examination on the same morning. Rich and poor, caring parents, orphans, everybody. One examination, that's it. We now believe, don't we, that to give children equality of opportunity, we have to do many other things. We have to give preschool education to the areas which need it most. We have to give special assistance to children who need to learn English as a second language. We need to concentrate medical care on those areas of the country where the children of the poor are still deprived. Now, is that a practical political possibility, or is the cost of that always going to hold back the radical cause?
Well, I think, look, there's always going to be an interplay between the cost of what you want to do and your objectives. But is that the objective of any, certainly left-of-centre government? Absolutely. And I think there's a very, very important point here about the purpose of left-of-centre politics. And it comes back to the point that the professor was raising, that in the end, to me, what distinguishes left-of-centre from right-of-centre politics is that we believe it is only through the community or society acting, whether it's through government or in other ways, acting and being prepared to take interventionist action to secure equality of opportunity, that this is going to become a reality.
Well, this is all very good, but rather general in a way. I mean, in a sense, what Roy was asking about, it seemed to me the fundamental, is what you do to children. Because if you're talking about equality of opportunity, you're talking about people's opportunity in terms of their life chances over the head of their lives. And what I think is the biggest scandal at the moment, and has been for 10, 12, 20 years, is the gross neglect of education in this country, and the board school mentality that's come out of successive governments with regard to education, as though it's kind of outdoor relief for the poor, in effect. And what I would like to see, if a future Labour government really was serious about equality of opportunity, is a really massive investment into education and a kind of crusade on that. And that's, in a sort of way, it's rather lacking at the moment. One doesn't get the feeling that this government's going through a terrible time in the education field, quite rightly, but one doesn't get the feeling that there is a really bold Labour alternative which would transform our kind of sync comprehensives and alter the whole structure and picture of education in this country, not just in terms of fitting people for the few jobs that are available, but in terms of creating the possibility for a greater fulfilment of life in a wider sense.
Can I ask you, Galbraith, about one of the peculiarly British diseases? There are many, but the British disease that says success depends on an education system that meets the needs of an intellectual elite and the rest have to somehow fall in behind it. Do you find that a strange aspect of British education, or do you think this is how Western democracies in general might progress?
No, I certainly think it's a strange aspect. I want to see everybody have the same access to education, depending on their ability, of course. There isn't complete uniformity in the mental competence, at least of the students I've had over the years. But I would like to see an equal access. But there's another point here. It's awfully easy for us to talk about the opportunity for the poor, the opportunity for the deprived. This must also be at some cost to a diminished opportunity for the very affluent, for the very rich, because that is where some of the resources must come from. So we can't talk about the poor without occasionally having reference to the privileged. This, it seems to me, is an inescapable fact that one has to address also where that money is coming from. Well, I'm prepared to do it. I think nothing so contributes to social tranquility as a few screams of anguish from the very rich.
Well, let me ask you a question related to exactly Professor Galbraith's point. I take it as axiomatic, again, that the rich will in many ways, at least in the long term, benefit from redistribution. That redistribution is not simply for the benefit of the lower income group, but for society as a whole. Is that just sentimental?
No, that is an absolutely...
Well, no, I don't think it's unrealistically sentimental, but I think that there needs to be, I would say, three very clear conditions injected into this. I mean, the first is that I think it is probably dishonest to say, well, this is all the very rich. There's this, you can just, you know, you can herd a few hundred of them into a little corral and get all the money from them.
Oh,
so there's no real. No, I
wasn't doing that. I'm prepared to have a few thousand or a few million.
Well, I think
quite a difference.
I mean, I think one has to recognise that it is a bigger question than that. I think that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that I think it is very, very important that on the left of centre this argument is not presented as an anti-wealth argument or a belief that somehow it's sort of morally sinful that these people have money, but on the other hand, as part of the necessary redistribution to make a society fair and just and function properly. And I think that thirdly, and I think this is probably as big a political question as any that faces the left of centre now, I think people have got to understand that the problem that people have in relation to taxes and tax increases is not merely that they're going to be asked to pay more, but they want to be sure that government, when it gets that money, is going to put it to ends that are efficient, and the money that they are then going to be paying out is actually going to reach the end use for which it is claimed, namely better education or better health provision or whatever.
The last election, the Liberal Democrats had what seemed to me a very reasonable policy of a penny on income tax to go to education. And that was quite specific. People knew where it was going to go. Why doesn't the Labour Party take up that kind of policy?
Well, I mean, I think one's always going to be a wee bit careful with the Liberal Democrats in this, but I think that I've no doubt at all that people find it more acceptable now if they think that tax is being used for a specific purpose than they do if it's just, you know, into this vast government coffer goes a certain amount of their money and heaven knows what happens to it.
But I want to ask you one other question. People watching us tonight have been conditioned over the last 20 years to believe in something quite different from the principles we've laid down. They've been conditioned to believe that by letting the rich surge ahead, the whole community is helped. The trickle-down effect, the theory of echelon advance. Do any of us believe that the future for the generality of society is a few people dashing ahead and dragging the rest behind them?
Roy, one of the problems with only talking about equality in a kind of limited sense is that we talk about the redistribution of wealth and not the creation of wealth. So we need to make the link between opportunity and general economic growth. But I think we also need to recognise there are, for instance, people who earn their millions not because they've inherited it, not because they've won it in the pools, but because they have, let us say, invented a wonderful new piece of computer software. They've got out there and sold it, they've built a company, they've employed more people, and in the process they've made a lot of money. That seems to me terrific. We need more of them. We need to create the conditions in which those businesses will flourish, which include creating more of the highly educated people who will do those inventions and work for those companies. And then we need to say, we can fairly take a contribution from that company and from that millionaire in order to create even greater opportunities, which will create a better economic base for everybody in the future.
Surely, I mean, it's not a matter of these lucky, brilliant, successful people who we all admire who sell a better computer software. If one is going to have genuine redistribution, it's got to be taxing a lot of sort of medium, affluent, ordinary people and workers and so on. And that's the problem that Tony is referring to. And my worry is really that if one goes down the line of saying you've got always to appeal to these taxpayers and therefore you can't push them too hard, and that one is sort of persuading them that it's in their interests, that one probably won't get anywhere. That one has to have some, for a party on the left, one has to have some kind of altruistic motivation and direction. One has to appeal to people at the level of saying, not that it's just in your interests, but this is desirable, this is good for society.
Well, let me, Tony, attack the shadow cabinet, of which you'll remember before the general election, absolving myself of all responsibility for the moment.
Yeah.
Don't you think that we should have talked more, as Ben Pimlott suggests, about a better society, a vision of society? Don't you think that we, and perhaps me in particular, I in particular, concentrated too much on the accountancy, on proving or attempting to prove our economic competence, and not enough on the sort of Britain we wanted to build in 10 years' time?
Well, I think that I don't actually agree with this criticism of Labour having failed to do this. I mean, let me give you my view of it. I think that First of all, I think in relation to economic competence, that is a necessary but insufficient precondition of winning an election. I think if you're economically incompetent or perceived to be, then you just forget it no matter what else you've got to offer. But I think that what is important for us to do is, in a sense, to break through the notion that I think the Tories want to set up, which is that you're choosing continually between your own self-interest and the creation of a strong and fair community. And I think that if we play that game for them and say, yes, okay, we admit, you're all going to be worse off, it's going to be bad for you, but, you know, there's a sort of better society at the end of the rainbow there. I mean, forget it. You won't win an election on that basis, and it's not actually what we're saying. And I think, you see, I think the problem of the Labour Party is rather different. I think the problem is that there is enormous strength in our underlying values and beliefs, but that we have, over a period of time on the left of centre, just failed to modernise the application of those to the world in which we live. So we've ended up confusing doctrines or particular policies for one era of social development with principles for all time.
There is a problem here, which is implicit in what Tony was saying, a choice that has to be made. Is one going to conduct an election from the left with the object of attracting the comfortable, attracting those who are fortunate? In the United States, attracting also those who have political money. Or is one going to sacrifice some support there and speak for the people who are deprived, speak for the people who are outside the system? That we can't, in a democracy, leave people without voice.
But can that party win?
This seems to me to be a large question, but it's much better that there be a voice than that there be a victory.
Well, let me ask you that question exactly. I'm going to ask each of you the question which Professor Galbraith points up.
I wanted to stress the point that since I'm not running for office, I can take the position that political defeat is better than political subterfuge.
Well, that is your very clear position now stated. Is there anybody else here, running for office or not, who believes that perhaps power has to be sacrificed in the interests of at least having the underprivileged represented and underprivileged having a voice?
Perhaps it's no coincidence, but I'm also not running for office, and I agree with every word that Professor Galbraith has said. I think it's morally desperate, but also I think it's politically desperate if a party of the left ends up running after the voters, and indeed running after the successful party, in order to see how it did it, and then trying to do it rather similarly, but perhaps not to quite the same extent. Now, it may be said that that is not what the Labour Party did at the last election. I would submit that that was how it was perceived by many people out there. And I think that the problem is that if you have a policy of Me Tooism, or sort of a moderated, progressive Me Tooism, that the voters end up by saying, well, you know, if they're a consumerist party, there's another better consumerist party. And I think that there is a case that for sort of standing by positions which may be temporarily unpopular, on the grounds that this is the historic heritage of one's own tradition, and this is what one believes, and one has to wait for the electors to come to one.
Now, Pat, you and I have run after electors in our time. We've
Absolutely.
pursued the voters around the country. How do you react to that?
Well, I don't think what Ben is saying is extremist. I think it is defeatist, and I think it is a betrayal. And I think this notion that it is the historic function of the Labour Party to give a voice to the dispossessed, but not actually bother to get power to do anything for the dispossessed, is quite absurd. I know it's not quite what Ken meant to say, but let me just caricature it like that for a moment. Because if we really accept the notion of an underclass, or if we pursue this idea that there is 1/3 down the bottom and 2/3 who are comfortable, I think we condemn ourselves to political oblivion, but I also think we misunderstand profoundly what is going on in society and what Labour's function ought to be. Of course we should be standing up for the poor and dispossessed, and we ought to be seeking to get power to do something for it. But we ought to be representing a vast number, the majority actually, of ordinary working people. And instead of saying there's somehow an underclass over here of the poor and dispossessed, and we will be very nice and give them a voice, and we won't worry too much if we lose elections in the meantime, we ought to be saying there is a commonality of interest amongst, if not the whole of the community, let us say the bottom 60 or 70 or even 80%, and go for that majority of
Tony,
common
I'm not
interests
gonna-
and
let me-
aspirations.
We've been failing to
Let me
appeal
put
to
this
those
question
people.
directly to Tony. I'm not going to ask you if you think the Labour Party ought to win elections, Tony, because it seems to me you're only likely to give one answer to that.
Yeah.
But what about the view that we can only win elections if we espouse great causes, that if we become simply a compassionate replica of the Tory party, who can manage the country's money as well as they do, but we might be a little more decent at the
not as
edges,
well as they do.
then we can't inspire the necessary enthusiasm amongst the people we need to drive us to victory.
Yeah, well, what we just had is, to me, I mean, quintessentially why the left has got itself into so many problems over the past few years, because we undermine ourselves constantly. Of course great causes are important. Of course that's the reason why you joined the Labour Party, I joined the Labour Party. But first of all, if we do not actually achieve power, then we do not help anybody. I mean, we have not stopped over the past 14 years the poll tax, the social security cuts, the social fund, mass unemployment. We've not stopped it. We've done nothing for poor people. So anyone who tells me that, you know, why don't you stand up for the poor rather than try and win elections, I mean, that seems to me an absurdity. And Ben, at the last election, I mean, you know, if the Labour Party had a tax problem down south, let us say, it was because of its the redistributive programme it was putting forward.
No,
I'm not saying
no,
that was wrong.
absolutely
but,
not.
I mean, the idea that,
No,
that
I think
somehow
on the
Labour lost
contrary, I think
because
that-
people down south
No.
were saying, well, you know, Labour's economic policy is exactly the same as the Tories. I think it would be
I think
bizarre.
that is quite wrong, and I think that, I mean, you put your finger on it in a way. I think that tax became an embarrassment to Labour in a way. As a matter of fact, it didn't become an embarrassment to the Liberal Democrats, precisely because it was an issue that Labour spent all its time trying to sweep under the carpet and pretend wasn't happening.
Excuse me, we started the election with a shadow budget. We put tax at the top of the agenda.
I've been accused by Patricia here of being defeatist. Well, I'm precisely looking back at a period in which Labour has been defeated. Labour has been defeated 4 times. The last 2 elections on the kind of programme that you are at the moment recommending. Now, I would like to ask you, what was it at the last election about Labour's, in many ways, excellent programme that was failing to meet up to the criteria you describe? It seemed to me very much along the lines you were saying. I mean, could it be that Labour needs to offer something more than a very plausible programme if it's to win?
Well, first of all, I think it would be bizarre to say, with the shadow budget of the last election, that really launched Labour's campaign, that Labour sort of tried to sweep tax under the carpet. I think that...
Well, at the very last minute, it decided to come clean.
No,
but up to that point, it had very much gone along the lines of saying that we are really very moderate now. You have to remember that we, the Labour Party, very, very moderate party.
Ben, the one thing...
It doesn't work.
Ben, the one thing I'm absolutely sure is that Labour did not lose the last election because people perceived it was too moderate. I mean, there may be all sorts of explanations, but that is not one of them.
They perceived that it was not an alternative.
No, I think
if you went out into the street and you asked people what the Labour Party stood for that was different from the Conservatives, they would either be wrong or they wouldn't know. And I think that is true
well, that's
today.
a different matter. Now, I would say that the reason why Labour lost the last election was in part that I don't think people had still believed the Labour Party was perceived as sufficiently trustworthy after all the problems that Labour had had in the early 1980s. But I think most important of all, they were not sure of the modern identity of Labour. And I would say that the way to achieve that modern identity is to take our values and apply them to the world in which we live, not allow ourselves to be pushed into a corner where it said, in effect, Labour, well, you represent 20 or 30% of the population, but nobody else, whereas we, of course, the Conservatives, represent the 70 or 80%. I mean, that is precisely where the Conservatives have put us in the last 10 years, and why we've not been able to break out of that.
So you're saying the modern identity is to be more like the Tories?
No, I don't think that. I think that is that fallacy in saying that what's actually being said here is if Labour stands up and says, we represent the majority of people in this country, well, like the Tory party, well, no wonder we lose elections if that's how Labour's...
No, what on earth is Me Tooist, given particularly... Look, we have in this country a Conservative party that is a party of privilege, a party of redistribution to the rich, a party which makes the poor worst off, and a party which has reduced this economy to its knees. So any idea that Labour wants to be Me Too seems to me completely balmy. But what is unsocialist, what is defeatist, what is giving up about Labour saying we want a dynamic, vibrant, modern, successful society in which every child has a decent opportunity, in which, as far as is humanly possible, we will prevent poverty, and where that isn't possible, we will have a decent system of benefits, as decent as we can possibly manage, and in which the vast majority of people can expect to flourish.
Let me put this proposition again to you all. I don't think what I've called the accountant war is a war that the Labour Party can win, because this is what's going to happen between now and the next election. The Shadow Chancellor is going to demonstrate, as it is right for him to demonstrate, our financial probity. Various spending ministries are going to exercise, through their shadow ministers, more and more pressure to commit us to greater spending. And within 6 weeks of the general election, there's going to be an equation in which the Labour Party is committed to spend more, and the Tories say we're going to put up taxes. And the Tory newspapers are going to exaggerate all that. I think that fight is one which we cannot win. And we can only win the next election by saying we'll do as well as we can on that battlefield, but our real advance must be through something which is more concerned with vision, more concerned with principle. That's why I think my view is a practical view for winning elections. Now, what is wrong with that thesis?
Well, I agree entirely with that thesis. I think that Labour has to put very high profile now, in a way I'm afraid it's not doing, that it is going to be a government, when it comes to power, that will invest in certain things. And I've mentioned education as being one, and not just invest in the sense of a little bits here and there, but on a very big scale. And not only is it going to invest, but that is going to cost money. And it's going to cost money, and people are going to have to pay that money. And I think that the Liberal Democrat technique of earmarking a particular bit of taxation for that purpose is one which does appeal to people. And I think if it starts doing that now, and gets people used to it over the next 2 or 3 years, it will not have to apologise at all about its taxation or its pre-election budget when the election comes. I think it's likely to be much more successful and effective than being terribly worried all the time about being terribly sensible and responsible on every time an issue comes up.
We've discussed political ideas on prime-time television, and that's a record of some sort. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Of course, our discussion didn't end with any conclusive answers. We all believe in more equality, though our definitions of the new society differ. We all believe the government has a duty to help in its creation, and none of us has any doubts that we all, rich no less than poor, have a vested interest in greater equality. But is equality a politically saleable commodity? On that subject, I speak only for myself. I believe that principle and power go hand in hand. Labour can only succeed, perhaps only survive, if we inspire the people with a vision of a better society. In any case, if Labour's not the party of equality, what's our purpose? What's the star that guides us? What do we stand for? We stand for equality.
Political events strip now on BBC Two. Football superhero scores an own goal in the crying game.